My 5-year-old daughter started crying that grandma's special vitamins made her feel sick. Hours later, she was lying in a hospital bed. The test results shocked everyone. The pills weren't vitamins at all. But before I begin, I want to make an important announcement about our channel. For the past 5 months, our channel has not been monetized, which means I'm not earning any money from YouTube ads. There are currently no ads running on our videos. Because of this, I also have to work another job, which makes it difficult for me to upload videos daily. If you enjoy our content and want to support the channel, please consider donating just $1. $1 may seem small, but if everyone supports together, it can make a huge difference and help keep this channel active. Your support will help me spend more time creating stories and uploading videos consistently instead of working another job. Of course, you can donate any amount you would like, and every donation truly helps and means a lot to me. To support the channel, please click the donation link in the video description or pinned comment. You can also scan the QR code shown on the screen to donate quickly and easily. Thank you so much for supporting. Now, let's dive into today's story. Nolan Mercer had grown up believing that family was the one thing you could trust without question. His parents had been steady people, not perfect but present. His father was the kind of man who came to every baseball game and never once left early. His mother kept birthdays sacred and held grudges against no one. They had built something quiet and solid, and Nolan had carried that belief into his own home without ever examining it too closely. He built his version of it in a 2-story house on Cranberry Ridge Drive, outside Columbus, Ohio. The yard had a wide porch and a concrete ramp that ran along the side, smooth and gently sloped because his daughter, Ava, needed it. He had installed that ramp himself on a cold Saturday morning in February, measuring twice and pouring concrete 3 different times before the angle felt right. He was proud of it, not in the way men boast about things, but in the private, settled way of a person who has done exactly what needed doing. Ava was 5 years old. She had been born with cerebral palsy, and she used a wheelchair. Her body didn't always cooperate with her, but her mind moved fast, and her laugh was the kind that made a room feel larger. She had Delaney's brown eyes and Nolan's habit of watching people quietly before deciding what to say. She loved animals, banana pancakes, and a particular picture book about a girl who trained horses. She had read it so many times the spine had cracked in 2 places. Nolan had taped it together with clear packing tape, and Ava had told him that made it better, more like a real adventure book that had been around the world. She was, without any calculation, the center of his life. Delaney was a good mother. Nolan believed that in full. She was present and warm, and she knew the names of every one of Ava's therapists. She knew the schedule. Occupational on Tuesdays, physical therapy on Thursdays, speech check-ins every other Friday. She packed the bag the night before, asked the right questions at appointments, and celebrated every small milestone with the kind of enthusiasm that did not feel performed. Nolan had watched his wife and daughter together enough times to know that the love between them was genuine. What Delaney could not seem to do was refuse her mother anything. Judith Parker was a woman who had never been wrong. That was not how Nolan would have described her in the early years. Back then, he had used words like confident and particular. He understood those qualities. He could work with them. But by the time Ava was born, something in Judith's behavior had sharpened into something else. Something he watched from across rooms and couldn't quite name. She was not cruel in obvious ways. She didn't shout or slam things. She simply sat in the particular way she always sat, back straight, one hand resting over the other, and made comments that settled into the air like smoke. That child needs a lot of attention. The first time she said it, Ava was not quite 2. They were at a family lunch, and Nolan had just finished cutting Ava's food into small pieces. He looked up, and Judith was watching him the way someone watches a clock, noting the time, calculating. All children do, Nolan said. Judith smiled thinly. Yes, but some more than others. He let it go. That was his mistake. He let it go because Delaney was right there and hadn't reacted, and he told himself that meant it was nothing. But Judith said it again. Not the same words. She was careful with her words, but the same idea, wearing different clothes each time. Delaney never gets to just enjoy herself anymore. You two would have had so much more freedom before all the appointments. I just worry about my daughter. She didn't sign up for this kind of life. Nolan confronted her about it 3 separate times. Each time, Judith looked at him with calm, patient eyes and told him he had misunderstood. Each time, Delaney stepped in before the conversation could finish and said her mother meant nothing by it, that he was reading too much into things. He began paying attention in a different way after that, not listening for what Judith said, but watching what she did. She bought gifts for her other grandchildren. 2 of Delaney's cousins had children around Ava's age, a boy named Theo who collected toy trains and a girl named Maisie who loved craft kits. Judith remembered their birthdays with wrapped packages and cards written in her neat, controlled handwriting. She arrived at those family gatherings bearing things. She never brought Ava anything. Not once in 5 years had Judith Parker walked through their front door carrying something for Ava. She hugged Theo. She told Maisie her dress was pretty. She asked Delaney's cousin about the kids' schools, their sports, their teachers. She walked past Ava's wheelchair like it was furniture. Nolan had a habit of doing the math. Not consciously, it was more like a background process running while he loaded the dishwasher or drove to the hardware store. He would find himself tallying things he hadn't meant to tally. How many times Judith had visited in the last 6 months? How many of those visits included a gift or a token for Ava? How many times she had asked about Ava's therapy progress versus how many times she had asked about Theo's soccer league or Maisie's dance recital? The numbers never landed anywhere good. He tried talking to Delaney about the gift disparity once, using the most careful language he could find. He laid it out simply. Judith had brought birthday presents for both of Delaney's cousin's children 3 years running and had not once brought Ava so much as a card. Delaney's answer was that her mother expressed love differently. Nolan sat with that for a while. He turned it over and examined it from several angles and arrived at the same conclusion each time. There was no version of differently that explained away 3 years of nothing for a grandchild in the same family. Differently was a word people used when they wanted to grant permission to behavior that did not deserve it. What made it harder was that Judith was not ignorant of Ava's situation. She knew about the cerebral palsy. She knew about the wheelchair and the therapy schedule and the specific challenges Ava navigated every day. She had been present at the family gathering when Ava, then 3, had worked for several minutes to pick up a small block from the floor and finally managed it. And Nolan had watched Delaney's cousin respond with genuine delight and Judith respond with nothing. Not even a glance. She had been looking at her phone. He had stayed very still in that moment. He had made himself stay still, but he had filed it away the way he had been filing things away for years. Each incident another piece of evidence in a case he hadn't yet decided whether to bring. The therapy appointments were their own kind of clock. Tuesdays for occupational therapy with a therapist named Bev who had a way of turning exercises into games that kept Ava engaged. Thursdays for physical therapy with a man named Dr. Anand who was quiet and patient and never made Ava feel rushed. Every other Friday for speech, which Ava didn't strictly need, but which helped her with articulation and projection. She had a tendency to go quiet when she was uncertain, and the sessions gave her tools for pushing through that. Nolan attended everything he could. He sat in the waiting rooms and learned the names of the other families, the rhythms of each clinic, the particular smell of each waiting area. He became the kind of father who knew which insurance codes to argue and which practitioners were actually good at their work versus good at billing. He became, without planning to, something of an expert. Judith had never once asked how any of it was going. Ava noticed. She was young, but she was watching the way children watch when they're trying to understand something that doesn't add up. Nolan caught her looking at Judith's hand sometimes, checking whether she was carrying a bag, whether something might be in it. And when there wasn't, Ava would look away and find something else to focus on, her face carefully neutral in the way children learn when they have had to protect themselves from small disappointments. That expression on his daughter's face, that careful, practiced neutrality, made something tighten in Nolan's chest every time he saw it. The night Ava asked the question, it was late in October. The house had that particular quiet that only comes after a child has been put to bed. The toys settled, the lights low, the day releasing its grip. Nolan had read her the horse book, the one with the tape on the spine, and they had finished the last page and closed it, and he was about to stand up when Ava spoke. "Daddy." "Yeah, bug." She looked at her hands. She was doing that thing she did when she was choosing words carefully, turning something over in her mind before releasing it. He waited. He had learned that with Ava, waiting was the right answer almost every time. "Why doesn't Grandma like me?" The question moved through him like cold water. He sat back down on the edge of her mattress and kept his face still because she was watching him now, and he knew whatever she saw in his expression would become part of her understanding of the answer. "What makes you think that?" he asked. Ava looked down at the blanket. Her fingers traced the edge of it. "Because she smiles at everybody else." He didn't speak for a moment. He was measuring what to say against what was true and trying to find where those two things could exist together without breaking her. "She smiles at you," he said because he had to say something. "Not the same way." Ava raised her eyes to his. "It's a different smile, Daddy. The one she uses for me is the kind you do when you're being polite." 5 years old, she had already learned to read the difference between genuine warmth and practice performance. He thought about the ramp he had built in the cold, about the tape on the spine of her favorite book, about every small, careful thing he had done to make her world feel solid, and he felt the first real stirring of something close to fury, because none of it could protect her from this. He could build ramps. He could tape books. He could not reshape Judith Parker. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind Ava's ear. "I think Grandma has a hard time with people she doesn't understand. And she doesn't understand people like you. People in wheelchairs. People who are strong," he said. "It makes some adults uncomfortable." Ava thought about that. She didn't look entirely convinced, but she didn't push it either. She curled down into the pillow, and he pulled the blanket up and kissed her forehead and turned out the light. He found Delaney in the kitchen. She was washing a cup she had already washed, the way she did when she was somewhere else in her head. He waited until she turned off the water. "Ava asked me tonight why your mother doesn't like her," he said. Delaney set the cup down carefully. "What did you tell her?" "Something that wouldn't hurt her." "But we need to talk about this, Delaney. Your mother has been doing this for years. Ava is 5, and she's already picking it up." "Doing what exactly?" Delaney turned. Her voice had that particular quality it got when she was bracing herself. Not defensive yet, but ready to become defensive. "Treating her like she doesn't exist. Never a gift, never a hug, never a real question about how she's doing. She lights up for every other grandchild in that family, and she looks straight through Ava. She's not comfortable around." Delaney stopped. Started again. "She grew up differently. She doesn't know how to. She knows how to hug Maisie," Nolan said. "She knows how to remember Theo's birthday." Delaney's jaw tightened. "You're making a problem where there isn't one. Our daughter asked me why her grandmother doesn't like her. That is the problem. That's the whole problem, right there. Children ask all kinds of things. It doesn't mean she could see it, Delaney." She wasn't guessing. She was describing something she had been watching and trying to figure out. "Our 5-year-old has been sitting in the same room as your mother for years, trying to understand why she's being treated differently, and she finally got around to asking." Delaney turned back to the sink. "I'll talk to her. You've said that before. I'll talk to her." Nolan stood in the kitchen doorway for a long moment, watching his wife stare at the faucet. Then he turned and walked back toward Ava's room. He stood in the hallway outside her door and listened until he heard the slow, even rhythm of her breathing. For the first time, standing in that quiet hallway, he let himself see clearly what he had been softening for years. His wife was not choosing Judith over Ava in any conscious, deliberate way. She was simply doing what she had always done, giving her mother the benefit of every doubt, smoothing over every edge, folding every hard truth into something manageable. It was not malice. It was something older and more deeply rooted than malice, which in some ways made it worse. Because malice you could fight. You could name it and hold it up to the light and refuse it. What Delaney carried was something she didn't know she was carrying, and he did not yet know if she would ever be able to put it down. Delaney called her mother that weekend, after the conversation about Ava's question. Nolan was in the garage working on the car when she made the call. He could hear the murmur of her voice through the door, the careful, managed tone she used with Judith that was different from the tone she used with everyone else. Lower, more deliberate, like she was always performing a slight edit before speaking. The call lasted 45 minutes. When Delaney came into the garage afterward, she told him she had spoken to her mother and that Judith understood she needed to be more attentive to Ava. Nolan looked at her over the hood of the car. What does that mean exactly? It means she's going to try harder. At what? Delaney folded her arms. At being present. At including her. He put down the wrench he was holding. He thought about Judith's face at the last family gathering, the deliberate way she had moved her attention away from anything that involved Ava, the careful performance of not noticing. He thought about whether a phone call from Delaney had the capacity to change the thing underneath that behavior. Okay, he said. He didn't believe it, but he had learned by then that saying so would only start a different argument, the argument about whether Judith could change, which was an argument Delaney could not lose because she needed her mother to be capable of it. Several months passed in the careful, surface-calm way that months pass in a household where something important is being avoided. Delaney spoke to Judith, or she said she had. The comments did not stop entirely, but they grew more infrequent, better timed for moments when Nolan was not within earshot. He noticed the calculation in that. The comments had not stopped because Judith understood they were wrong. They had moved because Judith understood she had been observed. The afternoon Nolan overheard the conversation in the kitchen was a Wednesday in late spring. He had come inside from the backyard where he had been filling in some cracked caulking along the base of the ramp. The back door opened quietly, the way it always did. He stopped in the small hallway off the kitchen when he heard Judith's voice, not because he intended to eavesdrop, but because something in her tone froze him in place. They thought he was still outside. She will need care for the rest of her life. Judith's voice was even. It was the voice she used when she was presenting facts, not opinions, as though the arrangement of words into complete sentences was enough to make them true. So, Delaney's reply was flat, cautious. So Delaney, a pause, waited. You still have time. Time for what? To start over. To have the life you were supposed to have. The silence that followed was long. Nolan stood in the hallway with his back against the wall and his hands very still and listened. You deserve something different, Judith said. Her voice had gone softer now, the voice she used when she wanted to sound reasonable, like she was offering a gift. You deserve to be free. You deserve a future that isn't built around therapy appointments and wheelchair ramps and, Mom, Delaney said quietly, I'm just saying what nobody else will say to you. Nobody says it because it isn't what I want. Today. But this doesn't get easier. You know that. Every year, she's my daughter. I know she is. A careful pause. I know she is. I just want you to think about yourself sometimes. I want you to remember that you matter too. That your life isn't over. Nolan stepped away from the wall and walked back down the hallway to the back door. He stood on the porch with his hands in his pockets and looked at the ramp he had built, the smooth concrete, the clean angle, the rubber grip strip he had added along one side so Ava's wheels wouldn't slip in the rain. He stood there for a long time. When he came inside later and Judith was still at the kitchen table drinking coffee, she greeted him the way she always greeted him, politely, without warmth, without acknowledgement of anything. Delaney handed him a glass of water. Nobody mentioned what had been said. That night, Nolan sat in the bedroom with the door closed and worked through what he knew. Judith had spent years making small comments. She had spent years treating Ava as though she barely existed. Now she was speaking in private to Delaney about starting over. She was describing Ava as a sentence. Not a child. Not a person with a name and a laugh and a favorite book with tape on the spine. A life sentence. An obstacle. A reason for her daughter's life to be less than it could have been. He thought about Ava asking him why her grandmother didn't smile at her the right way. He thought about that for a long time. He did not confront Delaney about it that night. He wanted to. There was part of him that was angry enough to put everything on the table right then and demand she account for it. But he held back because he understood that forcing a confrontation before he had a clear picture of what he was dealing with would only give Judith more room to maneuver. She was good at reframing. She was good at making her own position sound like concern. If he came at this too fast and too loud, he would be painted as overreacting, and Delaney would close around her mother the way she always did. He needed to be patient. He needed to watch. He did not yet know how little time he had. The morning after the overheard kitchen conversation, Nolan drove to Ava's occupational therapy appointment alone. Delaney had a work call she couldn't move, and Ava sat in the back seat with her hands in her lap and looked out the window at the trees going past. "What are we doing today?" she asked. "Bev," he said. "Tuesday." Ava made a sound of contentment. She liked Bev. Bev let her pick the music. They drove in comfortable quiet for a few miles. The trees along the road had gone green in the way they go in late spring. That particular saturated green that only lasts a few weeks before it deepens and loses its brightness. Nolan watched the road and thought about the conversation he had stood outside and listened to the day before, and thought about the attorney whose card was in his wallet, and thought about the distance between knowing something needed to change and being ready to change it. "Daddy," Ava said. "Yeah. Is everything okay with you and Mommy?" He checked her in the rearview mirror. She was watching him, that patient, measuring look she had, the one that saw more than he sometimes wanted to be seen. "Why do you ask? You both seem like you're thinking hard about something." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "We're working some things out. Grown-up things. Nothing you need to worry about." Ava seemed to accept this. She turned back to the window. "Okay," she said. And then, a few seconds later, "I love you, Daddy." "I love you too, Bug." He said it the same way he always said it, without decoration, just the plain fact of it. More than anything, the Saturday Judith offered to babysit began like any other weekend morning. Ava was at the kitchen table with her drawing supplies spread out in a wide arc around her, colored pencils organized by shade, a stack of blank paper, a small cup of water for the watercolor set she had received for her birthday. She was drawing a horse, the same horse she always drew, the one from the picture book, though by now she had added details the original illustration didn't have, a blue ribbon braided into the mane, a faint background of mountains. Delaney was on the phone with Judith when Nolan came downstairs. He could tell from Delaney's posture, shoulders slightly lifted, voice careful, that her mother was pressing something. She caught his eye and turned a degree away, and he poured coffee and did not ask. When Delaney hung up, she told him that her mother wanted to spend some time with Ava while they ran errands. There was an art show at the convention center, something Delaney had mentioned wanting to see. It would only be a few hours. Nolan looked up from his mug. "We can take Ava with us. She'd be bored." Delaney said it quickly. "Mom wants to spend time with her." She asked specifically. Something moved through him, a hesitation, a low-grade pull of unease. He ran through reasons to say no and reasons to say yes, and arrived at the thing that always tripped him up when it came to Judith. He did not have a reason, not a clear one, not one Delaney would accept. What he had was a feeling, shaped by overheard conversations and the look on his daughter's face at family lunches, and feelings were not arguments. He said yes. Nolan had the attorney's number memorized by the time of the hospital. He had not called it yet. He had been running the calculation, the one about when the right moment was and what the consequences of moving too early versus too late would be for Ava. He understood that divorce was not a small thing. He understood that a child needed both parents, and that whatever happened between him and Delaney, Ava's relationship with her mother was something worth preserving if it could be preserved. He had been patient. He had been more patient than he had believed himself capable of being. And then he had stood in the doorway of his daughter's bedroom and seen her lying against her pillow with a face the color of old paper, her eyes struggling to find him, and said something to her that he couldn't even hear himself say because the only thing he was doing was counting her breaths. Judith arrived at 11. She kissed Delaney's cheek and patted Nolan's arm and walked into the kitchen where Ava was still drawing. She sat down across the table and said Ava's name and told her the horse was very nice. Ava looked up at her with a careful expression, the one she used with her grandmother, and said thank you. Nolan stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. He memorized the picture, his daughter at the table, Judith across from her, the colored pencils in their arc, the cup of water, the horse with the blue ribbon in its mane. Then he and Delaney left. They were gone 3 hours. At the art show, Nolan moved through the booths without fully seeing them. He bought Delaney a small print she had stopped in front of twice, and she smiled at him the way she used to smile, easy and real, and for a little while the thing that sat between them most days was quiet. On the drive home, Nolan's phone showed no messages. He checked it twice. Judith opened the front door before they reached it. Her expression was arranged into something careful and composed, but underneath it, there was a tightness that did not belong to a normal afternoon. "She's resting," Judith said. She seemed a little tired. Nolan looked past her toward the stairs. "Ava doesn't usually nap. Children get tired." Judith stepped back from a door with the small, managed smile of a person who has decided on a story. He went upstairs. Ava was in her room, propped against her pillows, her face the color of old paper. The usual brightness in her eyes was gone, replaced by something flat and heavy, the look of a child whose body has stopped feeling right and doesn't fully understand why. "Daddy." Her voice was smaller than normal, thinner. He crossed the room and crouched beside the bed, pressed the back of his hand to her forehead. She was warm, slightly, but that wasn't the main thing. The main thing was her eyes, the way they were having trouble tracking him. "Hey, Bug, how are you feeling?" "Grandma gave me special vitamins," she said. "She said they would help me feel better." He kept his face still. "What do they look like?" Ava considered. "Small, white." She said they were children's vitamins, but they were really little, and she only had one bottle, and she put them back in her purse after. Nolan stood up slowly. He went to the doorway and called down the stairs for Delaney. Then he came back and sat on the bed and held Ava's hand and watched her face while the minutes moved. 20 minutes later, Ava vomited. Then she complained that the room felt like it was leaning. Then she went very quiet in a way that was not sleep. Her breathing was there, steady enough, but she was unreachable, and when Nolan said her name, she didn't respond. He dialed 911 before he had fully decided to. He was already talking to the dispatcher when he registered that he was talking to the dispatcher. Judith appeared in the doorway behind Delaney. Her face had gone tight. "She's fine," Judith said. "She just needs to sleep it off." Nolan did not look at her. He kept his eyes on his daughter and his voice level and gave the dispatcher their address. The hospital waiting room smelled like cleaning solution and recycled air. Nolan sat in a plastic chair in the corridor outside the pediatric bay and did not move for 2.5 hours. He got up once to get water, came back, sat down, and did not move again. Delaney sat beside him. Judith had driven herself and sat across from them, slightly apart, with her hands folded and her expression of careful composure in place. Nolan did not speak to her. Delaney tried twice to start conversation, and both times he gave short answers, and she stopped. The waiting room outside the pediatric bay had a bulletin board near the water fountain covered in children's drawings, crayon and marker, suns with faces and houses with smoke coming from the chimneys, the standard vocabulary of childhood art. Nolan looked at it for a while during the 2.5 hours he sat in that corridor. He looked at the drawings and thought about Ava's horse with the blue ribbon in its mane and the way she always drew the ribbon in a specific shade of blue. Not dark blue, not light blue, but the exact blue of the sky about an hour before sunset, which she had once described to him as the most serious blue. That was Ava. She had taxonomies for things. She had categories and distinctions, and she applied them with quiet precision, and she was 5 years old, and she was down the hall in a room with machines attached to her because her grandmother had given her a pill. He looked at the drawings on the bulletin board and held all of that inside him and did not let it out. The physician who came to find them was a man named Dr. Waits, direct, calm, with the manner of someone who had learned a long time ago how to deliver bad news without making it worse. He looked at the three of them and asked if they could step into a private room. Nolan glanced at Judith and back. "She can wait here," he said. In the small consultation room, Dr. Waits laid it out plainly. The test had flagged a sedative compound in Ava's system, an adult sedative, the kind not prescribed to children, the kind that would affect a 5-year-old's nervous system at a level far beyond what the dose was calibrated for. "She will be fine," Dr. Waits said first. He said it first because he was good at this. "She's sleeping now, a real sleep, and her vitals have stabilized. We'll keep her through tonight for monitoring, but we expect a full recovery." Nolan exhaled once, the way a man exhales when a cable he has been pulling against with everything he has finally releases. How did my daughter get an adult sedative? He asked. That's what we need to understand, Dr. Waite said. He looked at both of them carefully. She told the nurse that her grandmother gave her vitamins. The room was very quiet. It may have been a mistake, Delaney said. Her voice was low and fast. They could have been mixed up. Someone could have. The compound found in her blood does not match any over-the-counter children's supplement, Dr. Waite said. He was not unkind, but he was clear. This was a prescription sedative, an adult prescription, administered to a child. Nolan kept his eyes on the table between them. He was thinking about the way Judith had said she's fine. She just needs to sleep it off. He was thinking about the small white tablets in the bottle that went back into her purse. Thank you, he said to the doctor. Thank you for telling us clearly. They walked back to the waiting room. Judith looked up when they appeared in the doorway, and something shifted in her expression, a reading of the room, a calculation. She knew from the way Nolan was moving. She's going to be fine, Delaney said. Judith closed her eyes briefly and pressed one hand to her chest. Thank God. Nolan pulled out his phone. He found the non-emergency police line first, then reconsidered, then found the main line and started dialing. What are you doing? Delaney asked. Calling the police. The words landed quietly, but the effect was not quiet. Delaney's hand came out and closed over his forearm. No. He looked at her. Delaney, you're not calling the police on my mother. She gave our daughter an adult sedative. Ava was unconscious. We were in a hospital room for 2 hours, not knowing if it was a mistake. Delaney's voice was low and controlled and frightened. It had to be a mistake. She would never. She put the bottle back in her purse. He said it quietly, each word placed with care. She didn't put it down. She didn't show you. She kept it in her bag and put it back. That is not a mistake, Delaney. That is a decision. Delaney's grip on his arm tightened. If you do this, you will destroy her life. You will destroy everything. She gave our daughter a sedative. You don't know that. The doctor just told us. You don't know she meant. Across the waiting room, a couple with a toddler had gone very still. A man in a corner chair had stopped looking at his phone. Nolan lowered his voice, but did not step back. I'm calling, he said. Delaney moved. She stepped directly between him and the space in front of him, both hands up slightly, the way a person stands when they are physically blocking something. Her eyes were wet. Please, she said, please don't do this to her. He looked at his wife's face for a long moment, the face he had known for 9 years, the face that had told him she was pregnant, and the face that had looked at him with absolute certainty on their wedding day. He looked at it now and saw something he had been avoiding seeing for a long time. She was choosing Judith, not because she didn't love Ava. He believed, at his core, that she loved Ava. But when it came down to the moment, the exact moment, she had stepped between him and accountability. She was standing in a hospital where their daughter lay sedated in a room down the hall, and she was protecting the woman who had done it. He stepped around her and finished dialing. The officers arrived within 20 minutes. Delaney stood to the side with her arms crossed, and Judith sat very still with her hands in her lap, and Nolan gave the officers the account from the beginning. The vitamins, the bottle that went back into Judith's purse, the rapid deterioration, the hospital, the test results. Judith told them she had made a mistake, that she thought they were children's vitamins, that she hadn't realized. She said it with composure and appropriate distress, and she said it well. She had always been good at being believed. The officers took notes. They took Judith's information. They said someone would follow up. Delaney didn't speak to Nolan for the rest of the night. Ava woke the next morning clear-eyed and hungry, which Dr. Waite said was a good sign. She ate half a bowl of oatmeal and told the nurse that she liked the color of her scrubs, which were green. The nurse laughed. Some of the weight that had been sitting on Nolan's chest since the day before began to shift. He waited until the nurse had gone and the room was quiet. He sat in the chair beside Ava's bed and watched her eat for a minute, and then he said her name gently. Can I ask you something about yesterday? She looked at him over her spoon, nodded. When Grandma gave you the vitamins, can you tell me what happened? What she said. Ava set the spoon down. She looked at the tray, not at him. She was doing that thing again, sorting through her words, deciding what to carry out and what to leave behind. After a moment, she whispered, Grandma said if I took them, Mommy could finally rest. The room was very quiet. What do you mean? Nolan asked, keeping his voice level with some effort. She said Mommy was tired. Ava's fingers found the edge of the hospital blanket, the same gesture as home, tracing the hem of things. She said Mommy never gets to sleep, and she said the vitamins would help. A pause. She still wasn't looking at him. She said, I make Mommy tired. Nolan sat very still. He was conscious of his breathing. He was conscious of the weight of his hands in his lap and the distance between his chair and his daughter's bed and the sound of the hospital outside the closed room door. Did she say anything else? He asked. Ava started to cry. Not loudly. Ava didn't cry loudly. She cried the way she did most things, carefully, with her chin down, as though she were trying to keep it contained. The tears moved down her face, and she didn't wipe them. She said, I was the reason you and Mommy were sad. Ava said. She said if I wasn't so much trouble, everything would be better. Nolan got up from the chair and sat on the bed beside her and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him and cried quietly against his shirt. He held her and didn't speak and didn't move and let her cry for as long as she needed to. When she had quieted, he pressed his lips to the top of her head. None of that is true, he said. Not one word of it. Do you understand me? She nodded against his shirt. You are not trouble. You are not the reason for anything bad. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, and I am going to make sure nobody ever says anything like that to you again. He meant it in the way that a man means something when he has stopped negotiating with himself and arrived at a fixed point. There was no more softening this. There was no more waiting to see if Judith would change. No more hoping that Delaney would find a way to stand between her mother and her daughter. He had a 5-year-old who had been told by an adult who was supposed to love her that her existence was a problem, that she was a burden, that the world would rest easier without her. He walked out into the corridor and called the detective who had taken his statement the night before. He told him what Ava had said. He asked that it be added to the file. Then he called a family law attorney whose card he had been keeping in his wallet for 2 weeks. Since the night, he stood in the hallway outside Ava's room and understood, for the first time, the true shape of what he was dealing with. The detective assigned to the case was a woman named Rita Malone, and she was thorough in the way that certain investigators are thorough, not perfunctory, not routine, but with the specific, unhurried attention of someone who understands that the small details are where things live. She interviewed Nolan twice. She interviewed the hospital staff. She interviewed the neighbor who had seen Judith arrive and leave. She requested Judith's phone records with a specificity that told Nolan she had already begun building a picture. Judith maintained the story of the accident for the first round of interviews. She had grabbed the wrong bottle. She had thought they were children's vitamins. She kept them in her bag because her joints bothered her in the evenings, and she sometimes mixed up which compartment she was reaching into. She was devastated. She would never intentionally harm Ava. She loved her grandchildren. Detective Malone listened and took notes and gave no indication of what she thought. Then the phone records came back. Nolan was not present when the detective reviewed them, but Rita Malone called him on a Thursday afternoon and used the word significant, and something in how she said it told him the ground had shifted. What the record showed was not a single message or 2 careless words typed in a bad moment. What they showed was a pattern, months of texts sent from Judith's phone to Delaney's, to her sisters, to a friend she hadn't known since college. Messages in which Judith referred to Ava with a consistency and a specificity that left no room for misinterpretation. A burden, a life sentence. The reason Delaney can't have a real future. In one message, the one Detective Malone read to him over the phone, flat and deliberate, that said, in the plain language of a woman who believed she was speaking privately, if Ava wasn't in the picture, Delaney could start over and actually be happy. Nolan sat in his truck in the parking lot of his office building after that call. The engine was off. He sat there for a long time, looking at nothing. The word accident had never been true. He had known it wasn't true from the moment Judith said she's fine. She just needs to sleep it off. The composure that was wrong, the timeline that was wrong, the bottle that went back into the bag. He had known. But knowing something and having evidence of it are different things. And now the evidence was in a file in a police department, and the story of a well-meaning grandmother who made a terrible mistake was over. What replaced it was something colder, something that didn't have a charitable interpretation. Judith Parker had decided, somewhere over the years of watching her daughter raise a disabled child, that Ava was the obstacle to everything she wanted for Delaney. She had made a quiet plan, built on the belief that nobody would look closely at a grandmother offering vitamins, that a sedated child would simply sleep a long time, and that in the aftermath, she could manage the narrative. She had underestimated Nolan. Body Detective Malone had a way of conducting an interview that made you feel like the conversation was moving very slowly even when it wasn't. She asked questions and then waited, not impatiently, just still, while you found your answer. She wrote things in a small notebook with a fine-tipped pen, and she did not react visibly to what she wrote down, which Nolan had initially found disconcerting until he understood it as a sign that she was being careful with everything equally. The second interview, she brought him photographs of the text messages, printed on standard paper, date-stamped, the language reproduced exactly as it had been sent. She laid them on the table between them and watched him read. He read them slowly. He did not rush. When he finished the last page, he squared the stack on the table and slid it back to her. She never once, he said. His voice was steady. In 3 years of messages, she never once said Ava's name in a context that wasn't about removal. Detective Malone looked at him. No, she said. She's referred to her as a situation. Yes, and a circumstance. 3 times. Nolan looked at the table. My daughter has a name, he said. I know, Detective Malone said, and that's going to matter when we present this. Delaney read the messages a week after the charges were filed. Nolan did not know she had read them until he came home and found her sitting at the kitchen table with her phone face down in front of her and her eyes raw from crying. Not current crying, but the kind that leaves traces hours later, the redness that stays when the tears have stopped. He sat down across from her. How much did you know? He asked. He kept his voice even. It cost him something. I didn't know she was going to do anything. But the way she talked about Ava, the things she said, a long silence. Delaney's hands were flat on the table, pressing down, as though the table itself needed steadying. I told myself she was just venting, she said, that she worried in an extreme way, that she didn't really mean it. She said if Ava wasn't in the picture, you could start over and be happy. Delaney flinched. I know, you saw messages like that and kept bringing her to our house. I didn't know she would. Delaney stopped. Her voice broke at the edge of the sentence. I never thought she would actually, but you knew what she thought of our daughter. He said quietly. No shouting, no fury, just a fact, placed between them where it couldn't be moved. You knew how she thought about Ava, and you kept defending her. Delaney started crying again, quietly, with her face turned to the side. I love Ava, she said. I know you do. I love her more than anything. I know. Nolan looked at his hands on the table. But you could never stand against your mother. And eventually that became the same thing as standing against Ava. Not on purpose, but that's what it became. He had gone over this conversation in his head more times than he could count. In the car, in the dark before sleep, in the parking lot after the detective's call. He had looked for the version of it that ended differently. He had wanted to find a path where Delaney's love for Ava was enough, where he could lay this out and she could stand up and choose the right thing and they could find a way to move through it together. He couldn't find that path because even now, in this kitchen, with the charges filed and the messages real, Delaney was grieving her mother. She was grieving the image she had built and carried for decades. The image of Judith as a woman who meant well, who loved imperfectly but truly. She was not capable of letting that go and still being who she was. He understood that. He even felt something that was close to sorrow for her. But Ava was upstairs. He filed for divorce the following week. Body. The night before the divorce papers were filed, Nolan sat in Ava's room after she had gone to sleep. He didn't read to her. She was already out when he came in, worn down from a good day that had included a long session with Devin's family at the park, where Devin had spent an hour teaching Ava a specific technique for controlling her chair on uneven surfaces. She had come home proud and slightly tired and eaten dinner with the focused speed of a child who has used her body all day. He sat in the chair by her bed and watched her sleep. The nightlight was on, a small lamp in the shape of a rabbit that cast a soft circle of yellow light across the floor. The room smelled like the lavender spray Delaney had always used on the sheets, which was the kind of thing Nolan had kept doing without thinking about it, because Ava liked it. He sat in the quiet and thought about the years ahead, the appointments and the games and the school days and the conversations he would need to be ready for. He thought about the questions she would ask as she got older. Harder questions than why doesn't grandma like me, questions about what had happened and why, questions about her own life and what it meant and where it was going. He thought about all of that and felt something settle in him. Not happiness exactly, not relief, something more like resolution. The feeling of a door that has finally been closed because you have finally stopped pretending it was open. Delaney called once more the next morning. Nolan answered. "You're destroying this family," she said. He had thought about this, too. He had practiced the patience required to say it clearly and without heat. "No," he said. "Your mother already did." He heard her breath on the line. He waited a moment, then said goodbye and ended the call. The courthouse downtown was a building of pale stone and high ceilings, with the kind of architecture that is meant to communicate permanence. Nolan arrived early on the first day of trial and sat on a bench near the back of the gallery until the proceedings began, then moved to the front with his attorney. The gallery filled steadily. He recognized some of the faces, family friends, neighbors, two of Delaney's cousins who sat quietly on the far side. Judith entered with her attorney and sat at the defense table. She was dressed in a dark blazer, her hair neat, her posture controlled. She looked, from a distance, exactly like herself, the composed, image-conscious woman who had sat at family tables for years and made careful comments and managed every room she was in. But up close, when Nolan briefly caught her eye before looking away, she was not the same. The confidence that had always lived in her eyes, the settled, proprietary quality of someone who had always been in charge, was diminished. What had replaced it was something harder to name. A tightness, a cautiousness that read, underneath all the composure, as fear. The prosecution built its case over 3 days. The physician from the hospital testified about the compound found in Ava's blood, explained what it was, explained what it did to an adult, and what it would do to a child of Ava's size and weight. He was careful and clinical, and the jury was very attentive. The detective testified next, the phone records, the text messages, the months of documentation. She read several of the messages aloud in the flat, even voice of a professional reading evidence, and the courtroom shifted perceptibly when she did. Nolan watched a juror in the second row, a woman in her 50s, look down at her notepad and not look up again for several seconds. Ava's statement was admitted through video, a recorded interview conducted in a child-safe environment, with a specially trained advocate asking the questions. They played it on a screen at the front of the courtroom. Ava's voice came through the speakers, small and clear and precise, describing the white tablets and the words her grandmother had said. Judith's attorney cross-examined aggressively. He challenged the medical conclusions. He challenged the interpretation of the text messages. They were venting, he said, the private frustrations of a mother worried about her daughter, not evidence of intent. He challenged the child interview methodology. He was skilled and he worked hard, and Nolan sat through all of it with his hands flat on his thighs and his face still. Judith took the stand herself. She was composed. She expressed remorse. She maintained that she had never intended harm, that she had made a terrible mistake, that she had not been thinking clearly, that she would carry the guilt of what had happened every day for the rest of her life. She said it all with the quiet conviction of a person who had rehearsed sincerity until it fit. Her voice broke at a precise moment when she spoke about Delaney. Nolan watched the jury watch her. He could not read their faces, and he had stopped trying. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Body. The courtroom had a clock on the back wall that Nolan could see from his seat, an analog clock with a plain white face and a thin red second hand. He watched it move during the long stretches of procedural testimony. He watched it during the cross-examination. He watched it when the jury filed out to deliberate and the courtroom went to its low, waiting hum. For hours, he had expected more. He had steeled himself for a longer wait, for the grinding uncertainty of a deliberation that stretched across a day or two. When the bailiff appeared and said the jury had reached a verdict, his attorney looked up from her phone with an expression that Nolan read carefully before allowing himself to read anything into it. They filed back in. The foreperson was a man in his late 40s with the bearing of someone who had made decisions before and was comfortable making them. He stood when the judge asked if they had reached a verdict. Nolan waited in the courthouse corridor with his attorney and did not speak much. He bought coffee from the machine down the hall and drank half of it. He thought about Ava at school, a half-day kindergarten program that had started in September, with a teacher named Ms. Adeyemi who had told Nolan during orientation that Ava was one of the most perceptive children she had ever taught, and that she meant that as the specific and earned compliment it was. He thought about that. When the jury returned, the foreperson stood and read the verdict without preamble. Guilty. The words settled over the room. Nolan felt it the way you feel the sudden absence of something that has been pressing against you for a long time. Not relief exactly, but a kind of release. A loosening. The judge sentenced Judith to 28 months in a state correctional facility, with additional supervised probation on release, and issued a permanent no-contact order with respect to Ava. The gavel came down. Deputies moved toward the defense table. Judith turned once and looked toward the gallery. She was looking for Delaney. She found her. Delaney was in the second row, her hands in her lap, her face carrying the particular expression of someone who has arrived at a place they can no longer deny. She looked at her mother. She did not move. Nobody came to her. For the first time in perhaps her entire life, Judith Parker had reached for someone to rescue her and found nothing but air. Prison took the things from Judith that she had built her identity around. It took her mornings at home and her carefully controlled environment and the deference of people who had always moved around her with a kind of accommodating caution. It took her standing in the community she had cultivated for decades, the church committees, the neighborhood associations, the circle of women who had always accepted her at face value because she had always presented a face worth accepting. It took, gradually, the contact with family that she had expected to maintain even from inside, because the family had read the text messages, and some of them found they could not perform normalcy around what those messages contained. She lost her freedom and her reputation within months. Contact with her grandchildren, all of them, was restricted by various parents who had read the case coverage and made their own decisions. But the hardest consequence, the one that cost her what she had always cared about most, came from Delaney. 3 months after sentencing, Delaney requested to review all of the evidence that had been collected, not just the selected excerpts read in court, but the complete record of messages recovered from Judith's phone. Her attorney advised her that she didn't have to do this. She did it anyway. She read everything. She read the messages sent over 3 years of Thursday afternoons and quiet weekends, the accumulated private record of how her mother had thought about Ava when nobody she needed to manage was listening. The word burden appeared 17 times. The phrase life sentence appeared 6 times. There were messages to Judith's college friend describing Delaney's marriage as a prison she doesn't have the courage to leave. There were messages describing Ava's therapy appointments as the thing that swallows every week. There were messages in which Judith discussed, with the flat practicality of a woman making logistical plans, what Delaney's life might look like once the situation resolved. The situation. Her granddaughter, 5 years old with a laugh that filled rooms and a horse drawing with a blue ribbon in the mane. Delaney read all of it. It took her 4 hours. When she was done, she put the papers down and sat for a long time in the quiet of her apartment. She had moved out of the house by then, into a 2-bedroom place near her work, where she had spent the early weeks of the divorce relearning what her days were supposed to feel like without her mother as the organizing force. She had defended Judith Parker for years, not because she was naive. Delaney was not a naive woman, but because the alternative had felt unbearable, and now she understood that the alternative had happened anyway, and that it had taken everything from her that mattered. She had lost Nolan. She had lost the house on Cranberry Ridge with the ramp and the porch and the kitchen where Ava had spread her colored pencils in a wide arc. She had lost the daily life she had taken for granted. The mornings, the ordinary evenings, the the particular quiet of tucking in a child you love. She was rebuilding a relationship with Ava from the beginning, carefully one scheduled visit at a time, and Ava was kind to her in the way children are kind when they have decided to try again, but the ease was gone. The trust was something she was earning back by degrees, slowly, which was the only speed available. And Judith, for whom she had sacrificed all of it, was sitting in a correctional facility writing letters that Delaney no longer read. The wheelchair basketball gym was a converted community center on the east side of Columbus, with high ceilings and the particular energy of a place used heavily and loved. The floor had scuff marks from 100 afternoons of practice, and the bleachers were the kind that fold out of the wall and make a specific grinding sound when they extend. The air smelled like rubber and sweat and the industrial cleaner the custodian used on Friday afternoons. Nolan knew the smell by now. He had been to 17 games. Ava had started with the Junior Development Program the previous fall, an introductory league for children between 5 and 8, wheelchair athletes working on basics, dribbling, passing, the geometry of moving through a court with speed and intention. She had taken to it quickly, in the particular way she took to things that gave her body a language her condition sometimes denied her. On the court, she was fast. On the court, she was fearless. On the court, she laughed at a frequency that Nolan had never heard anywhere else. He sat in the second row of the folding bleachers, a paper cup of bad coffee getting cold beside him. He had arrived 45 minutes early, the way he always did to watch warm-ups. He liked the warm-ups. He liked watching Ava find her pace, the way she set her hands on the wheels and pushed and found her angle, adjusting without thinking. He liked watching her talk to the other kids, the easy, fast conversation of children who have found a shared thing they love. Today was a scrimmage, not a formal game. There were maybe 30 people in the bleachers, a few other parents, some siblings, a couple of grandparents. The noise was constant and cheerful and slightly chaotic in the way children's sports are always slightly chaotic. Nolan spotted Delaney when she arrived. She came in through the side door a few minutes after the scrimmage started and found a seat in the far corner of the bleachers. She was wearing a gray jacket he recognized. She sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the court. And after a moment, Ava came wheeling past at speed and Delaney's face changed. A quick brightness, involuntary and real. Nolan watched this and looked back at the court. The relationship between Delaney and Ava was 2 years in the making from the point of the divorce. Slow and careful and frequently difficult. Delaney had done everything the family counselor had recommended. She had shown up consistently. She had asked the right questions and not pressed for more than what was offered. She had earned, through patience and consistency and a willingness to sit with discomfort, a version of her daughter's trust. Not the whole of it, but a version. Nolan had not made it easy, but he had not made it impossible. Ava needed her mother, and he was clear-eyed enough to separate what had happened between him and Delaney from what Ava needed. The two things lived in different rooms. He kept them there. He never remarried. He had thought about it in the abstract, sometimes in the distant, hypothetical way you think about a country you might visit someday, and then set it aside. He had Ava and Ava's schedule, and the house he had repainted 2 summers ago in a yellow Ava had picked from a paint swatch fan, and his work, and the 17 wheelchair basketball games, and the evening ritual of the horsebook with the tape on the spine. Now 2 pieces of tape, the second one added when the binding had given out again under the weight of all those readings. He had enough. He had the right things. On the court, the scrimmage moved into its second half. Ava had the ball. She came up the right side fast, with a kid named Devin who was 8 and already the best player in the league shadowing her on the left. She faked toward Devin and pulled back and drove through the lane, and the ball arced up and off the backboard and through the net, and the small crowd erupted in the particular noise of people watching a child do something wonderful. Ava threw her hands up. She was grinning so wide it changed her whole face. Nolan stood up. He was clapping, and he didn't sit back down. When the scrimmage ended, Ava came rolling toward the bleachers with her team crowded around her, everyone talking over everyone else. She was still grinning. She had a streak of court dust on her right forearm from a defensive play in the second quarter that she was wearing like a badge. She rolled up to the base of the bleachers and looked at her father, and the grin softened into something quieter, something private, the way certain expressions are only for certain people. "Did you see that shot?" she asked. "Every inch of it," Nolan said. She laughed, her real laugh, the one that filled rooms. Then she reached up both arms, and he leaned down, and she hugged him, her hands locked behind his neck, her cheek against his shoulder. "Thanks for protecting me, Daddy," she said. He held on for a moment longer than she expected. She let him. He had thought about Judith sometimes, over the 2 years since sentencing. Not with hatred, which would have required energy he chose not to spend. More with a cold, settled clarity, the way you think about a storm that damaged something and then moved on. She had looked at his daughter, this child in this gym, with this laugh, and seen an obstacle. She had spent years trying to make Ava feel like less than she was. She had, in the end, administered medication to a 5-year-old because she had convinced herself that Ava's existence was the reason her daughter's life was imperfect. Judith had lost everything: her freedom, her standing, her family. The carefully managed version of herself she had spent decades constructing. She had lost all of it trying to diminish a little girl who turned out to be the strongest person in the room. Ava pulled back and smoothed her jersey and turned to say something to Devin, and the conversation exploded back into the cheerful noise of children with somewhere to be and things to talk about. Nolan picked up his cold coffee and finished it. Across the gym, Delaney was making her way down from the bleachers with her eyes on Ava, and in a few minutes she would say hello and Ava would respond with the cautious warmth she was slowly expanding, and they would stand together for a few minutes while the gym cleared. Nolan watched his daughter in the middle of the noise and the movement and the ordinary joy of Saturday afternoon, and felt the specific, grounded certainty of a man who had made the right choices when the choices were hard, and whose daughter was safe. That was the whole of it. That was enough.